Hi everybody, and welcome to this program all about the RNAV approach in the Q400. Now I have to say that this has been one of the most difficult videos to film for the channel because the resources available to study how it's actually done in the real Q400 are fairly sparse and variable, coupled with the fact that in Europe we're still very much behind the times with RNAV. The Americans have been using it to excellent effect for many years, but many of our international airports in Europe still don't have any published RNAV procedures whatsoever. What I'm also going to do in this video is show you the go-around procedure in the Q400. Now this is difficult for a different reason. Hand flying the Q400 is, as I'm sure you know, tricky enough. But doing a go-around procedure, particularly at light weights, when things happen very quickly, the airplane accelerates and climbs very fast, doing this on your own is even harder. So of course in real life there'd be two of us, so pilot flying handles the airplane and pilot monitoring assists essentially with all the other items that need to be done. And it's for this reason that I would thoroughly recommend that you invest, if you haven't already, in the FS2 Crew package that essentially places a first officer in your sim. Of course with two people the go around becomes entirely straightforward, as does the initial takeoff and climb, which is also a little bit tricky in the Q400 when you're flying on your own. Indeed, all the other slightly trickier elements in the Q400 become easy once you've got something like FS2 Crew, when you've got basically two people operating in the flight deck. So my go-around is done without the help of FS2 Crew. For those of you who don't have it, I did it entirely on my own, and as a result it's a little bit scrappy. But hopefully you'll get the gist. It's a procedure that does need practice if it's to be done well, especially if you're doing it on your own without FS2 Crew, or of course a partner in your shared cockpit. And you can do, I believe in the Pro Edition and above, you can do shared cockpit operations in the Majestic Q400. I haven't actually done it myself, but it sounds like a really good idea. Anyway, let's have a look at the approach. RNAV, short for area navigation, has been around a long time, but in Europe we've been really glacially slow to adopt it. What it does in effect is rid us of the need for navigation by conventional radio nav aids, and instead we navigate to theoretical points in space essentially, and we can fly to these using the FMS, the IRS and the GPS systems as we have on all modern airliners. And this form of navigation can be used to form standard instrument departures, en route navigation, arrival procedures and instrument approaches. And we've looked at the RNAV approach on this channel before, in the 737 in fact, so do go back and have a look at that in conjunction with this video if you wish. But the great thing about RNAV is that, hallelujah, it avoids the need to perform the NDB approach at airfields that have published RNAV procedures. And given the unreliability and difficulty in using NDBs, which in my view should have been decommissioned years ago, they're just not safe in my opinion, RNAV is a really great thing in light of this. But as we've said, many European airfields don't have RNAV procedures yet, so if an ILS becomes unserviceable, it may well be that we have to perform an NDB approach, and it's for that reason that we still have to know how to fly them. Hence the video that I did on the NDB approach in the Q400 on this channel, and again you're welcome to go back to that and refresh your memory on it. So the RNAV GNSS approach, which is the most commonly featured approach in Europe, there are other forms of RNAV approach, and I'm thinking particularly of the RNAV RNP approach, which requires greater navigational accuracy and has things like RF or curved legs. But these are not common in Europe. In fact, I don't even know if they exist in Europe, and I certainly don't know enough about them to do a video on them, although I do believe that the Q400, the Majestic Q400, is capable of them. We'll be doing the RNAV GNSS approach, which requires a navigational accuracy of 0.3 nautical miles, and we can check this and set it in the nav page of the FMS. We'll keep an eye on this to ensure that the ANP, the actual navigational performance, stays below this 0.3 nautical mile threshold. Also, because we're flying an approach that is essentially constructed within the FMS, we must make sure as part of the descent prep that we've checked every waypoint on the approach is correct by cross-checking it with our chart nice and carefully. And we must also check that the vertical profile in the FMS is correct too. If the approach trajectory, vertical or lateral, is not correct in the FMS database, we cannot perform the approach. The Universal FMS Manual states that an RNAV approach pattern summoned from the Flight Management System database must not be edited. And this is quite a crucial point here, and it catches some people out. If you select an RNAV approach in the Universal FMS, you then see that the approach trajectory isn't actually correct. Perhaps it misses a waypoint out, or it goes to the wrong waypoint. If you edit it yourself, you will be unable then to activate and fly the RNAV approach. So it's important that if during your descent preparation you check the RNAV approach that has been generated by the FMS, and you see that it isn't correct, it doesn't conform to what we have on the chart, then you can't fly that approach, and you'll have to do either the ILS if it's available. If not, then you'll have to do the NDB or some other painstaking approach. So the basic rule is, with the Universal FMS that we have in the Q400, leave any no link messages. Leave them as they are in the flight plan page. Don't delete any duplicate waypoints that you might have on the approach page. Again, it's not necessary, and it messes up the sequencing in the FMS such that you may not be able to actually perform, activate and fly the RNAV approach. So if there's any no link messages, any duplicate waypoints, don't delete them or change them, and don't edit the approach yourself. If you need to edit it, then it's not correct. You just leave it and you perform an NDB or a VOR or a localizer approach, whatever's available. And in the real airplane, you then tell the engineers, look, the RNAV approach in this database isn't correct. Can you change it, please? And they change it for you. Of course, we don't have that in the sim, but you get the point. You also have to check that the missed approach procedure is correct in the FMS. For an ordinary ILS or other conventional instrument approach, we wouldn't usually use LNAV in the Q400 for the missed approach, as we would in an Airbus or a Boeing airplane, for example. We'd use heading select. And you'll see that in my go-around video, I'm actually performing an ILS approach, not an RNAV approach, and so I use heading select. If I were doing an RNAV approach, I'd have used nav mode and used LNAV to navigate the missed approach procedure. For an RNAV approach then in the Q400, we do use LNAV, and we must ensure that the correct missed approach trajectory has been summoned from the flight management system. Now in real life, we'll never be cleared straight to the final approach fix of the RNAV approach. So in this case, the final approach fix, as you can see, is Bravo Bravo 33 Foxtrot. We would never, in real life, be cleared direct to Bravo Bravo 33 Foxtrot. Instead, for RNAV approaches, this is certainly how we do it in Europe anyway, you'll be cleared to an intermediary fix that is at least 2 miles from the final approach fix. So in our case, the intermediary fix, as you can see, is Ovdov. So we'll be cleared to Ovdov, at which point we should be at 2,800 feet. Now, once we're cleared to Ovdov by air traffic, we can perform a direct to Ovdov function in the flight management system. And at that stage, we can activate the approach in the nav page. As soon as the vertical deviation bar then appears on the PFD, we can dial our altitude down to the decision altitude of 740 feet. In reality, because it doesn't go up or down in tens in the Q400, instead it goes up in hundreds of feet, 800 feet will be perfectly sufficient. And we can then arm VNAV mode. The reason I'm telling you to wind the altitude down to the decision altitude rather than setting it to the go-round altitude, as we would normally for an ILS procedure, for example, is that I found that in the Q400, certainly the Majestic Q400, the system is a little bit temperamental, and sometimes it won't allow you to descend if you've set an altitude that is equivalent to your current altitude or higher. It won't actually descend down the VNAV trajectory if you've got a higher altitude set. So for that reason, I recommend that you set the decision altitude. 800 feet will be perfectly fine, and the airplane will then descend down to that altitude. The disadvantage of this, of course, which is not something we'd have if we were doing an ILS approach where we'd preset the go-round altitude, is that for the missed approach procedure, it's one more thing that we have to do. So we have to press the toga switches, set full power, climb away, get the gear up, and we also then have to wind the altitude up to 3,000 feet, which is our missed approach altitude for this arrival. And then we have to press nav and then heading select. So the disadvantage, as I say, is of winding the altitude down to the decision altitude rather than leaving it at the missed approach altitude as we would with an ILS approach, is that it's one more thing that you have to do. You have to set the missed approach altitude for the go-around. However, as I say, the system is somewhat temperamental, and I've found that sometimes the aircraft won't descend unless you've got that altitude setting at or near the decision altitude. So once we've armed the approach in the nav page of the FMS, and we're in LNAV mode, the vertical deviation bar has then come up. We've wound our altitude selector down to the decision altitude. 800 feet will be fine, and we've selected VNAV. On the FMA we should see LNAV approach and VNAV path, and once we're fully established on the final approach trajectory and on the VNAV trajectory as well, both of these modes should appear in green. Don't forget, this is the one time in the Q400 when we don't want alt-cell mode armed. If we do this, the aircraft will just level off at 800 feet, and we don't want to do that. If we do want to level off or perform a missed approach, that's our decision, but we don't want the aeroplane to do it for us because it might well mess up the approach. So what we'll do then is fly down the approach. We'll cross-check our altitudes. I do it every mile. That's because I'm a little less au fait with RNAV procedures, and so I'm a little bit apprehensive, a bit nervous about letting it do its own thing without cross-checking. So every single mile I check. Once we're 5 miles from the threshold, we should be at 1980 feet. 4 miles from the threshold, 1660. 3 miles, 1340, etc. You'll find that the airplane does this very, very accurately, and you should be absolutely on the dot every time. But it's extremely useful to cross-check this just as you would with well, any instrument approach really, particularly a non-precision approach. Once we get to the decision altitude of 740 feet, we must either disconnect the autopilot and land the airplane manually, or go around if we're not visual with the runway or the runway lights. Technically, VNAV will allow you to accurately fly the airplane, or allow the airplane to fly itself all the way down to the threshold. And it will do this, as I say, with immense precision, but we're not allowed to do that. RNAV approaches look on the instruments like a precision approach because they have lateral and vertical guidance. But don't forget, they are still considered to be non-precision approaches. I'm sure that eventually we'll get used to RNAV in Europe. Technology will develop such that we'll be able to do things like autolands off RNAV approaches, and eventually even the ILS will become a thing of the past. But until then, an RNAV approach has higher RVR minima and decision altitudes than the ILS approach, and it is considered a non-precision approach, just like the VOR, NDB or localizer. So if you're flying in poor visibility and the ILS is available, then the ILS is still your best bet. Okay, so that's a brief overview. Let's go and see how it's done in the aircraft. So air traffic have cleared us to OVDOV. We can use the direct to function in the FMS to take us directly to that waypoint. And once cleared for the approach, we can then arm the approach in the nav page of the FMS. LNAV will then turn to LNAV approach mode on the flight mode annunciator. Once the vertical navigation bar appears on the primary flight display and we're cleared for the approach, we can then arm VNAV, and VNAV path will then appear in green on the flight mode annunciator, showing us that the airplane is now following the vertical trajectory in the flight plan page. Once we get closer, we can then wind the altitude selector down to the decision altitude, or as near as we can get it. Not forgetting, of course, that we don't want alt cell armed for the approach. Once we're established on the final approach track or turning on it, we can then turn our heading selector to the final approach track. The aircraft will then very accurately fly down the approach trajectory, and all you need to do is cross-check. I do it every mile, but you might want to do it just every 2 miles, that your actual altitude corresponds with the altitude you should be at on your aerodrome chart. So that's really it for the RNAV procedure in the Q400. It's fairly straightforward, as you can see, but not entirely intuitive, so it's good to know how to do it. I also wanted to show you in this video the go-around procedure in the Q400. Now this was again very difficult to film and actually pretty difficult to do, certainly on your own without the help of FS2 crew or another helping hand. What it's supposed to look like is that you disconnect the autopilot on deciding that you need to go around. So what you're going to do is disconnect the autopilot, press the toga switches on the power levers, smoothly advance the power levers to full power, and you're going to pitch up to 9 degrees. You then confirm that the power is set, and also confirm that you have flap 15. If you'd had flap 35 set, then you need to retract the flaps by 1 stage to 15 degrees. At that stage then, you establish that you're in a positive rate of climb, select the landing gear up, and then select either heading if you're doing a visual or a instrument approach, a visual or a conventional instrument approach, or, as we've already discussed, if you've done the RNAV approach, then you will select NAV. So establish a positive rate of climb, select the gear up, either NAV or heading depending on which approach you've been doing, and then alt cell. And don't forget, of course, for the RNAV missed approach, where you don't have the missed approach altitude preset, you'll have to set that first and then select alt cell. So there's a lot to do. Once at acceleration altitude, so 1,000 feet above aerodrome level, we're going to select flap 0, engage the autopilot, select the bleeds on and normal, confirm we have the bleeds amber indication on the engine display, and then set climb power to 900. So let's now see all that in action in my less than perfect but still perfectly usable go around.
Minimums.
So there we go, that is the RNAV and the missed approach procedures done in the Q400. Not the easiest film to make, I have to say, and I hope it was nevertheless of some use. And don't forget, of course, any questions you have, stick them in the comments and I will endeavour to answer them. Thanks very much for watching, folks.